Good morning, and thank you for joining in today. Our lesson is session 11 in the quarterly, but if you follow along in your Bible, you'll need to turn over to chapter 6 of Daniel. We finished up chapter 4 last week with Nebuchadnezzar's words in the final verse, which read, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." Now, that was King Nebuchadnezzar's expression following the return of his sanity after spending 7 years among the animals, sleeping, eating, and believing himself to be an animal. He recognized that his pride and arrogance was the cause of the judgment that had befallen him, as he gave honor in this last verse to Daniel's God. He regained his kingdom for a while and his authority for a few years before his death. And we really don't know if he continued to have the same good mind of God that he had expressed at the end of our study, including him. But we like to believe that by losing his sanity for a while, he was able to find saving grace for his soul. Today's lesson skips all the way over to chapter 6. But I like to read the in-between sections in order to get the whole picture and a little better understanding for myself. So when I began to read in chapter 5, it opened in verse 1 with a new king in Babylon, King Belshazzar. And that caught me way off guard because I like to think chronologically, and I wanted to know what happened between the last verse of chapter 4 with King Nebuchadnezzar in power, and then the first verse of chapter 5 speaking of King Belshazzar in the midst of a party. I know the missing information doesn't affect the purpose of the scriptures, but I wanted to know how we switched kings without warning, or at least that's what it felt like to me. So I ended up with even more questions because the history seemed a little bit vague, or either I just didn't have the right resources. But anyway, Belshazzar was assumed to be Nebuchadnezzar's son, and he was referred to that in the scriptures. But actually, it seems that he was not. He may have been a grandson through his mother's relationship with Nebuchadnezzar, but nonetheless, he was king of Babylon at the time that chapter 5 was accounted for. And there was a question with some people about how long he had been in power. Some believe that he had reigned for 17 years, and others say no, it was only 3. But what is certain is that the Persian king, Cyrus, was gaining power. Now, Babylon, was a strong nation. It was the king there was known throughout the world at that time. Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest of all. But at this point, Belshazzar was king, and the Persian king Cyrus was gaining power, and he had his eye on Babylon. Well, Belshazzar was a little bit of a party animal, and he was holding a banquet with the flow of a lot of wine for about 1,000 of his nobles. Now, that was a pretty big party. But you might remember, go back when Nebuchadnezzar made his final departure from Jerusalem, he cleaned out the temple of its valuable items. And at this party, King Belshazzar gave orders for the gold and silver goblets that had been taken from the temple be brought into his feast so that the people in attendance could drink from them. So in the midst of all of his great festivities, a human hand appeared and began to write on the plaster of the wall. None of his wise men could tell what the writing said. So the queen, actually it was the queen mother, suggested that he send for Daniel, since he was the one that Nebuchadnezzar had appointed chief over all of the royal wise men. But now, before Daniel would reveal the meaning, he reviewed how God had blessed Nebuchadnezzar and how nations revered, and some of them even felt fear of him. He also reminded Belshazzar of how Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance and pride had cost him his sanity and had condemned him to live like an animal before regaining his kingdom. Then Daniel explained what the writing on the wall meant for Belshazzar, This king had foolishly not humbled himself, knowing what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar, but instead he had set himself up against the Lord by bringing goblets from his temple into his party. The writing was a message from God, which told that Belshazzar's days of reign had been numbered, and they are brought to an end. He had been weighed on the scales and was found lacking. His kingdom was going to be divided. This great kingdom of Babylon was going to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now, he might not have believed it, but that very night, Belshazzar was slain, and Darius the Mede, the first king of the Persian Empire, took over the kingdom of Babylon. So we begin the lesson in chapter 6 with yet another king. Darius, this king, was known for his administrative genius and also for his goodwill toward the people under his sovereignty. So using his administrative skills, he appointed 120 satraps or representatives to rule throughout the kingdom. The satraps had the responsibility of making sure that the king did not suffer any financial loss, probably from making sure that the taxes were collected appropriately. Well, he also appointed 3 administrators over these satraps. And of course, being the great person that he was and how he had established himself in the Babylonian kingdom, Daniel was one of those 3. But he was so distinguished by his exceptional qualities, Darius was going to set him over the whole kingdom. And the other administrators and some of the satraps didn't find too much favor in that. So they devised a plan to get rid of him. They couldn't find any way to corrupt him before the king in his governing affairs because he was so honest and so precise. So they went for his faith in God. Under the pretense of being very loyal and caring for the king, they convinced Darius to sign a decree stating that no one would pray to any god or any human for 30 days except to King Darius. And if one was found guilty of defying this decree, the punishment would be that they would be thrown into a lion's den. Now, these sneaky men knew Daniel's prayer habits. He had never hidden or altered his faith. It was well known throughout the city. And once the king signed that decree, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, it could not be repealed for any reason or for any person. Now, they also knew the king thought very highly of Daniel. I mean, he was about to give him a higher position than any of those people had. So that brings us to the first scriptures for today's lesson. And we'll start in chapter 6 with verses 10 and 11. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in his upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. Daniel knew about the decree. He knew the edict could not be changed, and he knew the consequences had also been publicized. So he knew that he would be risking death if he continued with his regular prayer routine, which he did without stammer or fail. His house had an upper room with a window that pointed toward Jerusalem. Now, the temple no longer existed in Jerusalem because Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed it, but that city still seemed to represent the presence of God for his people. So Daniel's routine was to pray in that upper room at the window 3 times every day, probably morning, noon, and evening. On his knees, he gave gratitude to God for leading and guiding his life. He did the very same thing before and after the decree was made. Now, several of these men went to observe Daniel in his prayer routine to assure that they had acceptable number of witnesses for their next move. And of course, they found Daniel in prayer. They knew they would. Not as any sort of protest was he praying, but simply maintaining the spiritual discipline that he normally practiced. Now, you can probably guess what they did next, but we'll read that account in the next scriptures, which would be verses 12 through 14. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days, any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, as a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. The accuser's spies were probably out of breath by the time they got to the king. They were in such a hurry to report their findings. Now, they first reminded the king of his decree, making sure that he remembered it was a Medes and Persian law that could not be revoked. And then they dropped the bomb that they could hardly wait to tell. They referred to Daniel as one of the Judean exiles, which made him sound more like an outsider and less likely to be loyal to the king. Now, Daniel truly had not conformed to the Babylonian culture and their gods, but he had been living there for quite a while. Darius was the 3rd king he had served, and every one of those kings had put him in a trusted government position. He was exiled when he was about 15, and according to the dates, he had to be about 65 years old now. And he was keeping the same prayer life that he had always had under all 3 kings. The king's face may have dropped when he was given the news. He was very displeased, not by Daniel praying to his God, but by the true purpose of these men proposing this damaging law and the fact that he had been duped into signing it. His highly trusted and respected administrator had been caught in a trap, and he himself had unknowingly played a part in it. It was true that the king could not change the law now, and the sentence had to be carried out the same day that the crime was committed. Now, the accusers must have found Daniel in his morning prayer session, because Darius spent the entire day, the rest of the day, trying to find a loophole to spare his life. But even the king's efforts found no way out, and the accusers made sure that the day did not end without the sentence being executed. So we'll take a look at the next scriptures, which would be verses 15 through 18. Then these men went together to the king and said to him, You know, your majesty, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. The conspirators reminded Darius that according to the Medes and the Persian law, his ordinance could not be altered. The king was, as we would say, between a rock and a hard spot. But he reluctantly sent Daniel to the lion's den, and he went along as well. He had some last words for Daniel, and they were words that created a little hope in him, a hope that the God that Daniel served would recognize his loyalty and faithfulness, and he would remember and reward Daniel. Daniel was put into the pit, the stone was rolled into place and wrapped with chains. The chains were covered with some soft clay, where the king and his nobles placed personal marks in that clay. And when it hardened, if the chains were moved, the seal would be broken. The seal guaranteed that no internet just shut off, but I'm going to repeat what I just said. I don't know how far it got before it cut off. But if these chains, the clay on the chains, when it was hardened, then if the chains were moved, the seal would be broken. And the seals would guarantee that no one, not even the king, who probably wanted to, could come at midnight for an attempted rescue. So Darius went back to his palace and he spent a long, restless night. He ate no food, maybe not fasting for religious reasons, but more likely he just could not eat because his misery consumed his appetite. Now, normally he would have had a huge meal and entertainment afterwards, but it was quiet in the palace that night. There was no music, no form of entertainment, no hustle bustle around preparing the king's meal. We probably have all had such a night as this, full of anxiety and hours that seemed to stand still, maybe walking the floor and looking out the window from time to time to see if any light of day was approaching. But then came the morning, as the song says, and we read about that in the next verses, in verses 19 through 23. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. Daniel, servant of the living God, the king said, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? And then Daniel spoke with the king. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him. And also before you, your majesty, I have not done harm. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. As soon as there was any light of day, King Darius rushed to the lion's den. Now, some research indicated that there was possibly an ancient custom that said if a tortured victim lived till the next day, then he could be pardoned from his sentence. Daniel's constant faith and his witness, his faithful witness, had made an impact on King Darius. And Darius was very grieved when he called out to Daniel that morning. His voice was probably trembling. But he still held on to hope that maybe the God that Daniel served might have faithfully saved him from the lions. And you can imagine the joy and the relief that have washed over him when he heard Daniel answer back from the den, saying that God has sent his angel to shut the mouths of the lions. The powerful king had spent the entire previous day trying to find a way to save Daniel, but what he couldn't do, Daniel's God could do. Now, Daniel had been found innocent by God in the matter of his conviction, and he left the den unharmed. His accusers were nowhere near, but they soon got the news and more, as we see in the last scripture for today, which will be verse 24. The king then gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den, they, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Daniel's conspirators were called out by the king. Darius considered them untrustworthy and malicious. He ordered them, their children, and their wives to be thrown into the den where they so anxiously had tried to end Daniel's life. And that seems like a cruel sentence, but Persian custom dictated the execution of families along with condemned men. And the hungry lions attacked them before they could even reach the floor of the den. The lesson stops with verse 24 right there. But if you read a little further, you'll see that Darius made a new decree. And I'd like to read that for you. And it's verses 25 through 28 in chapter 6. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and the peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. I want to thank you for joining in today. You know, God does not always save us from the lions or from the fires, or he doesn't give us mysterious understandings like he did Daniel and his 3 friends, but he does promise to always be with us, and we can trust his word for that. But may we be as faithful and strong in our trust as Daniel's example for us. Our prayers should include gratitude to God, who can be trusted in all circumstances. Now, I know this lesson was a little bit longer than usual, but if you just have 2 more minutes, I hope you will enjoy a very familiar old hymn. The words are there, so you can sing along too. You should, because singing is good for the heart and it's good for the soul. I hope you'll have a great week. Stay safe and help keep others safe as well. And remember to spread extra love tomorrow for Valentine's Day. We'd love to have you join us in person for Sunday school and worship, but if you can't, we're certainly glad to have you online. Now, I have to click on these little squares that are really far over. So let me see if I can see from here. There's 1, there's 2. Here we go.
I need thee every hour, most gracious Lord. No tender voice like thine can peace afford. I need thee, oh, I need thee. Every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior. I come to thee. I need thee every hour in joy or pain. Come quickly and abide, or life is vain. I need thee, oh, I need thee. Every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior. I come to thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior. I come to thee.